Hey guys, Brandon Koalas here, Director of the Salt Lake Community College Concurrent Enrollment Program, and today in this episode, we are going to be talking about process improvement. Now, throughout these episodes, there have been times when I've shown you process maps that we've worked on. And one thing that I have learned, especially after obtaining my Lean Six Sigma Black Belt certification. Now, let me pause for a second. For those of you who don't know what Lean Six Sigma is and what the black belt is, this is not martial arts. I mean, if I were to go up against, a black belt in Taekwondo, I mean, they would totally smear me. In fact, I used to be in Taekwondo. I had like a green belt and I went up against a black belt. Man, he just like wiped me out. So this is not martial arts. Lean Six Sigma is sort of a business process improvement training and certification that goes through how to eliminate waste within processes. It's used by a lot of different companies out there, especially in the manufacturing industry. Toyota is, I think, huge in Lean Six Sigma, and then there's some other companies. I can't remember the one that it came out of, but there's some of these big industries use Lean Six Sigma to really improve their processes. But just because it's used in the corporate world doesn't mean it can't be used in higher ed. And one of the things I've learned as I've gone through this training is that one of the best places to start for process improvement in higher education is with the process map. And the reason for that is because if you don't understand the process, the full process, and I'm not talking about, this little teeny part of the process, but the entire process. If you don't understand it, then sometimes what happens is we end up making improvements in like a certain step of the process because, maybe processing this form or something is kind of painful. So we're like, oh, well, hey, let's change this and this and this. And it's like, yay, it's working for us. This is fantastic. Our job's so much easier. But then you look down the line in the process either way, and it's like somebody else is saying, oh my gosh, whatever you did just created this huge bottleneck for us, or now we have to wait forever for you to do your thing in order for us to do our thing. So it's important before you begin any process improvement to really understand the broader context of that process. So today I'm going to walk you through process mapping, and I'm going to talk about a little bit of basic stuff on improving that process once you've mapped it. So with that said, let's step over here and I'm going to walk through some of the steps to process improvement. The first thing that you need to do when it comes to process improvement is to create a first rough draft of the process map. Now, to do this, you don't have to overthink it too much. Just try to find somebody who knows and understands the process overall and work with them, or if that person is you, sit down and make a process map to the best of your standing of the overall process. As the concurrent enrollment director, I have a pretty good understanding of how concurrent enrollment processes work from a high level. So I can sit down and put something together. It's not going to be perfect because I don't understand the nitty-gritty details of how some things operate. So later we'll get to that. But the first thing you need to do is have somebody just put together a rough draft. Because if you try to get all the stakeholders together in a room and say, let's come up with something from scratch, and you've got 10 people in there, it is going to take forever. It's going to frustrate everybody, and it's probably going to fall apart because you're going to get so tired and frustrated with it, they're not going to want to keep working on it. So have somebody create a first rough draft, and then you've got a starting point to work on when you bring people together. Now, you may be wondering, but I don't even know how to create a process map. And I was in the exact same place you were just like a year ago. So I'm going to take you over to my computer. I'm going to walk you through some tools and software you can use to create process maps. Now, you can go as simple as Microsoft Word. You're familiar with Word. There are shapes. You can know how to put text inside of shapes and draw lines. You can create a process map. But I'm going to show you some other tools that you can use, at least a tool that I use. There's a lot out there that will make that job significantly easier, and it's well worth your investment. So let's step over to my computer here, and I'll walk you through the software that I use, okay? All right, so to create a process map, I'm going to show you how I do that using Microsoft Visio. Now, the reason why I use Visio is not because that was necessarily by choice, but I'd looked into some other process mapping software out there. I think one was Lucid, and then there were a couple of others that I looked at that I was really excited to use. But in the end, IT came back and said, no, you can't pay the $10 a month to do that. You're going to have to use the Microsoft suite because that's what the college has already purchased. So I kind of got stuck using Visio. But again, we go back to resourceful and not resources. So I didn't have what I wanted, but I made do with what I had. So I'm going to walk through this using Visio, but you're going to find that a lot of these features and tools that I showed you are similar in other packages out there. And like I said, I mean, if you don't have access to any of these, again, that resourcefulness, you could use Microsoft Word, Shapes, and Lines. So let's go ahead and jump into Visio here. And I'm just going to go ahead and create a new document. We'll create a new cross-functional flowchart. So I'm going to hit create. And here we have the basic start of our flowchart. Now, what you've got here, or of our process map that we're going to create. You can give it a title up here. And the phases, like if you want to organize this by maybe this process, part of it occurs in January, another part in February. You could do that for phases. If part of it occurs at one location and another at another location, you can do that for phases. This is basically the columns. And then the function over here, I typically include here the name of the stakeholder, so the individual or the group who's performing these steps. So you can go ahead and double click and call it whatever you would like. So we can call this the secretary. And we can call this the director. Okay, and you can set up as many of those as you want here in Visio. If I wanted to add additional tracks or lanes, then I just come over here to this section and I can grab a swim lane and drop it over here. It's kind of a drag and drop technology, and a lot of these operate that way. Okay, so now to build your process map, you're just going to start dragging shapes out and labeling those shapes. It's as simple as that. And let me walk through some basic shapes and talk a little bit about what they are, because it's pretty common and consistent across all these software applications. And it boils down to there's only really a handful that you're actually going to use. Let me also say that when it comes to process mapping, so I do a lot of cave mapping. I do cave exploration and cave mapping. And if you have, like 5 cavers that do cave maps and they all come in and they map the same cave, each map is going to look totally different. There's going to be some general things. It's going to follow the same trend, but some of the details of the walls and the formations and the slopes and all that, it's going to be slightly different depending on how each caver interprets that. And that is okay. So don't worry about, how do I make this perfect? Am I capturing it right? It doesn't really matter. Just do the best you can to interpret the process the best you can interpret it, and you'll be okay. So don't worry, am I using the right shape or am I not? It doesn't really matter. Just do the best you can to capture the process. Okay, so most processes are going to have a start and an end. And you use this pill shape to indicate where the process stops and where the process ends. So I'm just going to drag this shape over here and drop it on down. And I'm just going to call this, we can call it whatever we want. Maybe it's process start. Maybe it's liaison uploads their syllabus. And that's really where this all begins. And you have to decide, where does it start and where does it end? So you throw that in there, and now you got to figure out what happens next. So let's walk through some of these shapes. So the rectangle here is simply just a process step. It's just something that happens within the process. The diamond is a decision. So we have a point in the process where somebody has to decide, you throw a question in there, and if it's a yes, the process goes this way. If it's a no, the process goes this way. If it's red, the process goes this way. If it's white, the process goes that way. So that's what a decision point is. We have sub-processes. So if as you're mapping out this process, you identify that there's one step where it just sort of branches off to this other thing that's just like this whole separate, completely unrelated process, but it somehow impacts our process, then maybe you'll call that a subprocess. So you drag that in and say, now it goes to HR and they do their thing and they've got some big complex process. Or maybe if it's important to know that, you don't throw the subprocess in there, but you actually map out what happens in HR. So that's the subprocess step. The document symbol basically means that some sort of a document is generated at this point. So maybe this step happens and this step happens and this step happens, and then based on all those things, this person then creates a document and then that document is sent off. So if you want to indicate the creation of a document or something that's happening with a document, you can use this symbol. When it comes to data, this can be data that is either input into a system or somehow generated. So that's sort of how you can use the data symbol. Now you'd ask, well, why don't I just use the square symbol? Why do I have to use all these? You don't, really. Process maps are a visual interpretation of a process. And you can do whatever you want. These different symbols just help you to visually identify at a glance sort of, at what point does data come into play, data input or output or whatever. At what point are there decisions made? So this helps you just to visually look at it and identify where are some of the key elements of this process. So like I said, you can design it however you would want, but just be aware that these symbols exist to help it be more readable when you're looking at the process map. The database symbol, if there's data being entered into a database, then you can use this symbol, or maybe you can use the data symbol. And external data, maybe there's external data that's pulled down from another system using an API, you could use that. And now you've got all these custom shapes. So if you've got something that you want to point out within your process map and make, sort of everybody aware of this thing that's important, and it repeats throughout the process, then you can create your own symbols and shapes and go from there. So there's a lot of flexibility in creating these process maps. Now, right now I'm looking at a process map that's all totally blue. A lot of times you have the option, like right here under the design feature, I can change the theme colors. So if I don't really like blue, I want something more like, let's go with sequence here. So now that changes my colors, helps things pop out. Under themes, maybe I just want like a wireframe theme, so it's a little easier to read. So there's all kinds of ways you can adjust the visuals to make it more pretty or more readable. It's up to you, like I said. Okay, so let's go ahead and walk through a little bit more on how we build this process map. I'm gonna change it back. I don't really like that, so I'm gonna change it to something more colorful and pretty and solid. Okay, so I've added my first step where the process begins. So now, once they upload their syllabus, we have a step. And this is going to be a secretary step. So I can drag and drop a shape, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to hover here over my shape and over this line. And I have the ability to click right here and just jump it to a step, and it automatically creates the arrow. So that's awesome. Now, if I was in Microsoft Word doing this, I'd have to create my shape. I'd have to grab a line, draw it out. So it's a little more work, but again, resourceful versus resourceful versus resources. So you make do with what you have. Use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without, right? So we drag the shape out there, it creates a line. I label what this step is. Let's see, email sent. And now I'm gonna go to the next one. So the next step is maybe a decision. So here in the decision, we can type in, what is the decision? Does, and I'm just making stuff up here, liaison like the idea of work. Okay, so there's your decision point. If they like it, if the answer is yes, then they're going to move over here. And if the answer is no, then maybe it goes to the director who is going to administer punishment. Now, here within this process system, I can drag this over here, and I want to label these lines. Whenever you have a decision point, you want to label what the two decisions are. So I'll click here, we'll double click, and we'll say yes. So if yes, it goes here, and we'll double click here, say no. Let's delete that line. Oh, and the arrow is going the wrong direction. So let's fix that. I'm going to delete the line, and now I'm just going to grab right here, and I'm going to drag this down to connect it in the right direction. And then we'll click again and hit no. And then we can fill in whatever the consequence is or whatever the next step is. And that's really all there is to it. So you just continue to go through this process of building your map. You can drag things around. So if I can click here, I can make this track bigger because I'm going to add more steps down here. Maybe I need to drag this down a little bit farther. And I need to take this guy and move it up here. So you're going to have to go into whatever software you have access to, figure out how to use it. And as you do that, you'll become more and more comfortable with building these maps to the point where you can generate one fairly quickly. Okay, so I think for now, that's all we're going to talk about with the software. But again, I would encourage you to go out and see what sort of options exist for you, either at your institution that you need to purchase or just what you can make do with. All right, so once you've finished that first draft of the process map, then the next thing you need to do is bring your stakeholders of that process together to refine it. Now, what you're going to do is grab anybody who is any way impacted or involved in the process. You're going to bring them together, and you can, print off a huge scale, of the process map. If you have to, print it off an 8.5 by 11, tape it together, but have a big copy of it or look on the computer, pull it up on a screen, and walk through step by step with the group and ask them, here's the first step. Is that accurate? And what you're going to find as you go through each step, some are going to say, yeah, that's perfect, that captures it. Others might say, oh, well, when I do this step, there's really like 15 other steps that have to be done in order for this to happen. And you're like, okay, I didn't know about that. Tell me what those are. And so you write them down, you add to the process map, refine it. So you may have started with a process map that has 50 steps. And after this meeting, you're going to find you've got a process map that has like 280 steps because there's a lot of the nitty-gritty details that you didn't know about that are important to know for the process. And when it comes to detail, you can be as nitty-gritty as you want, or you can be general. It's up to you, whatever works for you. There is no right or wrong. So you're going to bring everybody together, you're going to refine the process map, and then you're going to go back here to your rough draft and update that so that it reflects sort of what everybody agrees at that point is the reality of the process. Once you've done that, the next thing that you need to do is what's called a process walk. So a process walk is basically where you and other people, if you only have one person that can do it, that works, but ideally you're going to have maybe 2 or 3 people walk each step of the process, physically observing it being done, and they're not going to say anything other than maybe ask some clarifying questions. What you don't want when you do a process walk is to walk through and say, oh, well, did you think about doing this? Or maybe what about this? Giving ideas and making suggestions for improvement. This is not the time to do that. When you do a process walk, you are simply observing the process being done, and you're quietly taking notes of some important things that you need to know when it comes to process improvement. And you may have some ideas for improvement. You're not going to say it, you're not going to discuss it, but you may write it down there on your note sheet for the process walks. This is simply an observation. And like I said, you can ask some clarifying questions, like maybe they click on something and you're like, oh wait, how did you get to that point? I didn't quite notice that. Or can you explain to me like this step and why you do that step? You don't want to make them feel uncomfortable or nervous. You just want to say, we're here to kind of observe so we can get a sense of what's going on. And then later we'll talk to you and other stakeholders and figure out, how can we make this better if we identify some ways to do that. So during the process walk, simple observation. Let me step over to my computer now. I'm going to show you the sheet that we use when we're doing a process walk, and I'll walk through each element so you understand some things that you might look for when it comes to process improvement. So let's head over to the computer again and look at this. So when it comes to process walks, this is the interview sheet here that we use. Now, this is the sheet that's taken out into the field where those doing the process walk will take notes, and then they come back and they enter that here into this form where we collect the data. Now, if any of you have access to the Microsoft 365 suite, you can use, so this is basically a SharePoint site where we organize our process improvement stuff. So we've created a simple Microsoft form right here, and then that just flows right into an Excel document. You could do the same thing with Google Forms and with Google Sheets. So I would encourage you to leverage technology to pull your data together, and that makes it a little bit easier for processing down the road. So let's come back over here, and I'm going to walk you through all of these different questions here on our process walk interview sheet. So the first thing you want to know is how many people work on this step. So you're going to write down if there's a number and if there's any notes. So if there's just one person, then that could be a good thing or maybe a bad thing. If there's a lot of people, that could be a good thing or a bad thing. So you want to make notes here. Maybe there are way too many people working on this step, and there's potentially down the road a way to streamline it so you only have one person, and then it could go a little bit faster and smoother. So that's up to you, but that's an important piece of data to make note of, because sometimes that can be an indicator of where you could potentially improve this process. Next is what % of time does this person have to work on this step? If the person only has, 5% of their time, but you really need somebody who could work 20% of their time, then either you improve the process so that it only takes a small percentage of time, or maybe you need to look at hiring additional people or figuring out a reallocation of workload, or maybe there's a way you can even get rid of this step because it's consuming a whole bunch of somebody's time when they've got other priorities to work on. So you're going to want to make note of what % of this person's time is used to work on this step. Next, how long does it take for this person to complete this step between the time the work is available until the step is complete per unit? This is called lead time. So maybe they receive a form and then they have to wait for a bunch of stuff to happen. So they get the form, now they need to look up and send in a request for some information, and it takes 3 days for them to get that information back. Once they get it, then they send off another email to somebody to get some more information, and after that, finally they're able to go process the form and hand it off. So from the point it's available until they've finished it and signed off on the form and sent it off, how much time does it take? If it's taking, like 3 days or 5 days to get this done, and the whole process itself takes, 6 days, then maybe there's some real area for improvement in trying to shorten that time that person is waiting, that lead time. Next, how long would it take you to complete this step if you could work on it without being interrupted or having to wait for others? So if we go back here to the lead time, it takes 5 days to do it, but if I didn't have to wait for people, I could have it done in 15 minutes. There is a huge amount of wait time, and that is a major problem. So we need to figure out how can we reduce that wait time. Most processes, when you look at the total time it takes to do the process, the majority of the time in that process is wait time. So the more you can reduce it, the faster you can get things done, the more time you save, the more money you save, and the more headache you save for people. Okay, and that there is called touch time. So the amount of time they're actually physically touching the work. Next, we say what % of units that you have to complete this task are complete or accurate. So if you ask the person and they say, when I get these forms about, 50% of them are accurate, the rest of them, I have to go back to the person who sent it and say, hey, could you correct that? That takes me a bunch of time. Maybe if we go back to this lead time, a lot of their lead time is spent correcting bad information that's been given to them, incorrect information. So you want to know that. If they're all accurate, then that's fantastic. But if there are problems, that's an area where you could look at improving. Maybe the form is too complex. Maybe it's worded in a way that it just doesn't make sense, so everybody's getting that field wrong. So maybe a simple rewording can fix that. So what % of the units that you receive to complete this task are complete and accurate? Okay, now one thing that I failed to mention, I'm going to pause here for just a second, but before you observe the process or after it, you ask these questions. So you're not asking these questions as you're observing, but you probably want to block out some time before or after to ask these questions. If it makes sense for you to do them while you're observing them doing the process and interrupt that, that's okay, but generally you don't want to interrupt once they show you and begin doing the process. So I would recommend asking these questions either before or after you do the process observation. Okay, the next one is how many units are waiting to be worked on right now? And is that normal? And how long has the oldest unit been waiting for? This is work in progress, and this is what can create bottlenecks. So if they say, oh, well, I've got, like 180 that are sitting there waiting for me, it just, it takes me so long to get them done that they sort of stack up. And so I'm trying to get to them as fast as I can. That's good to know. If they say, but that's abnormal, like usually that doesn't happen, it's just that this other thing happened over here in some sort of backlog, then you might make a note of that and, just keep that in mind when you're processing the data. So how many units are waiting to be worked on and how long has the oldest been there? Now, if they say that the oldest one has been there for like 15 minutes, I'm like, an hour behind, maybe that's not a big deal. But, if they say it's been sitting here for like 3 months and you're like, oh, well, no wonder people are getting frustrated. That's important to know. So make a note of that. Next, do you have to set up anything before you begin this step? If so, how long does it take? This is called setup time. So if you ask them that question and they say, well, yeah, I set up this step, it usually takes me, like 2 minutes. No big deal. If they say, oh yeah, it takes forever, and that's why I decided to batch it because I got to do this and I got to take that and I got to get this thing in place and I got to talk to this person, I got to do that. Like that's a problem, and maybe you can look at, oh, well, let's see if we can figure out a way to make this setup easier for you or faster for you so that we're not waiting so long. So make note of that. Next, what system do you use to complete this task? This may be software, it might be equipment, it might be a process, it could be all kinds of things, but try to figure out what system do they use, because maybe the system they use is archaic and old, and if you were to update it, it could really speed things up and make things better. So make note of that. Next, do you batch process units for this step, or do you complete them as they come in? If so, how many units do you process at a time? If they say to you, no, I just handle them as I come in, then that's great. Usually when things are handled as they come in, it doesn't create any sort of backlogs or bottlenecks. But if they say, yeah, I usually wait until I have 10 and then I process them, it just makes it easier for me. Well, how long does it take you to get 10? Well, it usually takes like a week and a half, but it's just so much easier. It's like, oh, well, people over here are waiting and they need that. So if you could do this as they come in, that would really speed things up and make things a little bit better. The last question is, what issues or barriers do you encounter when completing this step that are painful or time-consuming? This is good to know, just generally, because they might say, well, this thing, like waiting on this person is a pain in the rear, or having all the errors, oh, it's such a pain, because I have to fix everything. Or maybe after I hand it off, the person is rude to me and I don't like that, and that makes me mad. There could be all kinds of things that they could bring up, but it's good to ask that question to find out if there's anything else that could potentially be causing problems. Okay, now once you've completed these interviews, now you're going to observe the process. And one of the things that I like to do, so you can see there's 3 columns here. The first one is process observations. One of the things that I like to do here in the process observations is make a note of everything that's being done so I can remember. So these are, what are you observing? It's not necessarily making a judgment, but it's just saying, okay, well, first they did this, then they did this, then they did this, and then they used this software, blah, blah, blah. So you make notes of that, and then you can make note of any improvement opportunities. So maybe you say that this person, every time they finish a form, they get up and they walk down the hall and they hand it to somebody, and then they come back and they work on the next one. So you could say there's a lot of travel time going on here. They're probably spending like 2 hours a day walking back and forth to deliver these forms individually. That's an area for improvement. You're not offering solutions at this point in this column. You're just saying, that seems to be a problem. When I observe this, there seems to be a problem there. And then you can put potential solutions. Now, you're not talking about these to the person. This is quietly to yourself observing, hey, like I think if we could digitize these forms, that would eliminate the walking back and forth. If we were to move their office, their cubicles here, and there's a free cubicle over here, so if we moved the position, that could help. So you're writing down some solutions as well, but again, you're not discussing these because then that can destroy sort of what you're observing and what the person is willing to disclose. If they feel at all like you're criticizing them or judging them, then that can create problems for the process walk. So you're simply observing and you're asking some questions. So maybe you ask a few follow-up questions to better understand the process, and then you go back and fill out your form. Okay, so once they've got this sheet filled out, then if you create a Google Doc or a Google form, they can come over here, they can copy their data in, and then that allows somebody to go in and do the analysis. Okay, and I think that's about it here when it comes to the process walk interview sheet and the process of doing a process walk, what you might ask. Okay, so now once you've finished the process walks, somebody is going to need to gather the data that you've collected and sort of compile that together and maybe do an analysis of it and come up with maybe some of the problems that were identified, some of the areas that could need improvement, and maybe some of the suggestions that were included on that sheet. So compile it together, and then you're going to bring the stakeholders back together and talk about the findings and discuss those. So maybe as you go through, you identified that, hey, whenever we do this step, the person who completes the step is having to wait a long time for the person before them. Is there anything that we could maybe do in order to help this person so that they're not having to wait as long? And then maybe in that discussion, the person who they're waiting on says, oh, well, they're waiting on me because, I do this thing, but I usually batch it, so I wait for a few weeks before I do it. Maybe I could just do them as they come in, and would that help? And then the person might say, oh man, that would be awesome. Things would go so much smoother. So then you decide, well, let's go ahead and make that change. So you talk through some of the findings, you write down a list of some of the improvements that can be made. So next step, we get into process improvements. So you identify the process improvements. Now, some of those may be like major projects. It might be totally revamping a part of the process. And those you might put up on the board of, this is what we're going to work on over the year. But then as you go through, you might say, oh, well, here's a couple of quick wins. We could change these today and sort of see what happens. So you'll make a list of those and you'll begin implementing them and see if they make a difference. Now, in an earlier video, we talked about project management and we talked about measuring and that sort of thing. That's something that you could certainly do during this process, but we're not going to get into that now. Right now, we're just talking about some of the basics of process mapping and how to use that. So once the improvements have been listed, and there may be some improvements as well that are just as simple as, why are we even doing this step? Like, we're doing it because, we've been doing it for a decade and that's just what we do. Well, maybe we can even get rid of that step right now. So think about, what are the major projects you're going to need to work on to improve the project? What are some quick wins, and start figuring out how to implement those. Now, once you've identified those process improvements and started playing around with them, after you've decided, man, this is totally a keeper, then you're going to go back and refine the process map. So you're sort of coming back here to that draft that has been refined, and you're going to refine it again. And hopefully now at this point, in the first draft, you had 50 steps. The second draft, you had 280. And now in the third draft, you're getting back down to the 50 steps. But it's extremely streamlined, simplified process. So instead of being bumpy and taking a long time and causing frustration, now at this point, it's a lean, mean process map machine that delivers results easier, faster, and with less cost associated with them. So right here is sort of the basics of process mapping. Hopefully, as we've gone through this, it's given you some ideas of some things you can do to better understand and improve your processes. Now, like I've said before, this is really just the beginning. There is so much more to process improvement. And I wish we had time and could cover all of this, but unfortunately we don't. But what I would encourage you to do, if you are interested in really honing your program so it operates with as little effort as possible and delivers as much value as possible, look into things like Lean Six Sigma. I went through a company called, I think it was called Go Lean Six Sigma, which was a great program, online videos. The whole course was online. I could operate at my own speed, and the cost wasn't too much compared to some of the other programs out there, but it was really, really great. I'd recommend doing a Lean Six Sigma training because it'll give you additional skills well beyond these. Like I said, this is just like 1% of Lean Six Sigma process improvement to help you really, really hone your program. Because I mean, more than anything, I mean, what do we want? We want to be able to focus on the things that really make an impact, make a difference. We don't want to be spending our time on, busy work that just, saps our time and energy, but we want to free up that time and energy so we have more time to focus on the things that bring fulfillment and meaning. And process improvement is one of the ways to do that. All right, as always, post any comments, ideas, suggestions that you have in the video, in the comments below the video. And as always, remember that none of this is impossible if you are resourceful, if you think outside the walls that have been built around you, and last of all, if you have the courage to act.